Sam Altman was in DC this week as part of a group to announce the launch of Stargate, which is a company that is going to spend $500 billion building data centers to support OpenAI. And he was there with Larry Ellison, who's CEO of Oracle, a cloud provider, Masayoshi Son, who's CEO of SoftBank, a Japanese technology group. And these are the funders for this new company, along with MGX, which is essentially Abu Dhabi-based sovereign wealth fund supported. So let's listen to Masayoshi Son on the plans for deploying these funds.
We would make this happen. We would immediately start deploying $100 billion with a goal of making $500 billion within next 4 years, within your term.
$500 billion is a lot of money because OpenAI has made probably about $6 billion in revenue so far. So clearly there's a very high expectation for the growth in compute needed by OpenAI to be able to cover costs of $500 billion, which probably include not just capital costs, but total operating costs of running these facilities. Now, questions immediately emerged around where this money was coming from none other than Elon Musk, saying that they do not have the money, and Sam Altman countering, well, they already have a site underway. And this is suggested by SemiAnalysis in the free portion of their newsletter to be a site in Texas, which was originally announced to be built between Larry Ellison of Oracle and OpenAI. Now, apparently, even $100 billion is what might be needed to cover just this site alone. So potentially 5 similar sites like this might get you up to $500 billion in total over the next 4 years. Now, where exactly does this money come from? Well, most likely some of it will be financed through debt that is yet to be raised, and a smaller portion probably financed through equity. The information reports that OpenAI and SoftBank are each to commit $19 billion. And there's also rumor that Oracle is potentially to put in about $7 billion. Now, Oracle is a highly profitable company, and it has a reasonable balance sheet. You can see it has about $10 billion on its balance sheet. So clearly, while it is quite profitable, it also has a lot of debt, total debt here of about $86 billion. So not necessarily obvious that Oracle would fund this by raising further debt or by just paying it off its balance sheet, given it has $10 billion. So it remains to be seen exactly how this will be financed. But ultimately, what Stargate is really doing is it is shifting OpenAI's reliance or use of Microsoft as a dataset provider to a new player. And in principle, this is good for OpenAI because it increases its optionality. Ultimately, OpenAI is a company that wants to sell tokens or intelligence. And compute is one of its input costs, where it would like to have as many players as possible providing the GPUs. It would love if there were more competitors to NVIDIA, and it would also love if there are more competitors to the big cloud providers like Azure from Microsoft or AWS from Amazon. So this is now a large contender. So let's see what Satya Nadella, CEO of Microsoft, thinks about all of this. He was over in Davos and gave his opinion.
Look, our partnership continues. We'll be a tech partner to Stargate, but more importantly, our partnership with OpenAI. You talked about exclusivity. OpenAI APIs are exclusive to Azure.
So OpenAI have an interesting deal with Microsoft that has been known for some time, whereby Microsoft injected significant money, I think $14 billion in investment, in order to fund a lot of the initial compute required for OpenAI. And in return, Microsoft got an equity stake. They are a large holder of stock in OpenAI, while also earning a revenue share believed to be 20% of OpenAI's profits. Now, this exclusivity arrangement means that the only provider of APIs other than OpenAI, I believe until 2030, is Microsoft, and that puts them in a strong position. Now, there have been rumor of Microsoft owning 49% of OpenAI. I'm not sure that's entirely true because OpenAI, of course, is undergoing restructuring. It is moving into a for-profit entity. And as part of that, there will be changes to what maybe had been previously agreed, including profit caps for some of the original investors. And I don't know if it is known exactly how that will shake out and what ownership Microsoft will ultimately have. But one way to look at this from Microsoft's standpoint is they got in very early and put in capital when the price of OpenAI shares was low. And Satya Nadella now probably has a meaningful equity stake and upside in the outcome here. And from a risk standpoint, it may just make sense to allow OpenAI to move and use other service providers. Let's listen a little more here.
For us, one of the things that in fact Stargate is beyond. Sam wants to continue with the scaling laws to build out more compute in order for him to train more models. And we have a ROFR. So he comes to us first. If we need those needs, then we clear it. If not, he can go to these other providers. And so therefore, I think it works out well for Sam and for us. So this was an adjustment, quite frankly, that we made in order to support both his needs, while at the same time keeping the integrity of need those needs, then we clear it. If not, he can go to these other providers. And so therefore, I think it works out well for Sam and scaling laws to build out more compute in order for him to train more models. And we have a ROFR. For us, one of the things that in fact Stargate is beyond. Sam wants to continue with
put OpenAI as a competitor on your list, which I thought must speak about your ambitions long term.
Yeah, but more importantly, I think for us, one of the things that in fact Stargate is beyond is, Sam wants to continue with the scaling laws to build out more compute in order for him to train more models. And we have a ROFR, so he comes to us first. If we meet those needs, then we clear it. If not, he can go to these other providers. And so therefore, I think it works out well for Sam and for us. So this was an adjustment, quite frankly, that we made in order to support both his needs, while at the same time keeping the integrity of what we wanted as the strategic value.
So Satya Nadella doing a very nice job laying out some nice rhetoric around how this is a good deal for OpenAI and Microsoft. And indeed, that could be true because it allows them to take on the right level of risks and investments that they have. But certainly, it seems nice for Microsoft that they got in with an equity stake early on in this project and can afford probably to step back. On the other hand, there are arguments I read on semi-analysis that maybe by backing off here from being a capital provider to fund more of these data centers, Microsoft is potentially losing out on the upside. But clearly, this is a very big bet to put in $500 billion over time on a project where there is currently about $6 billion in revenue to date. Moving now to export restrictions, and this is a very interesting map. There is now a list of tiers of countries that are eligible to receive GPUs without restrictions or with an exemption. And there is also a list of tier 3 countries that are banned. And this was updated on January 15th. And in blue, you see here the countries that you think are most permissive. So these are allowed exemptions on export controls. And in yellow, in rather pink here, there are the restricted countries, including Russia and China. Now, interestingly, there are only 18 countries that are on the allow list here. Ireland is one of them, but there are some notable absences. Switzerland is notably not on this allow list. Israel is not on the list. You can't see down here, but neither Malaysia nor Singapore are on the allow list either. And this is believed to be because of some re-exporting of GPUs that had been happening, whereby GPUs would be sent potentially to Malaysia or Singapore, and then they would be re-exported to countries that had export bans. Now, what does this mean? It means there are restrictions on 2 levels. There are restrictions on GPUs that are above a certain power or a certain density of compute. They will have restrictions on them. This means that NVIDIA and competitors have created a new class of GPUs falling below those restrictions, like the H20s instead of the H100s, which are restricted. And that means that only weaker computers will be allowed to be exported to these tier 2 and tier 3 countries. Now, if you're a tier 2 country, you can still receive GPUs, but it means that you must get specific clearance in order for a given country to receive. And there are limits. There's actually some allowance up to a small amount of GPUs that can be imported underneath the guidelines. The second level of export restrictions is around model weights. So models that are above a certain size, they are a certain amount of compute rather, they are also limited and may only be transferred within tier 1 without any prior explicit approval. Although there is an exception for open weights models, any models that are published openly, these restrictions do not apply. And last of all for this week, I'll cover DeepSeek reasoning model, which has just been released. I already talked about the reasoning models last week, including DeepSeek v3. Well, DeepSeek has now released the details in a paper of how it has aimed to catch up on OpenAI's O1 and O3 series of models. And the report here results on reasoning a little bit hard to see, but they're showing them to compare, they're showing their reasoning model to compare favorably with OpenAI's reasoning model right here. Now, one of the best tests, as I discussed last week, is to look at the ARC prize. This is a challenge that is relatively straightforward for humans, but difficult for AIs. And I've pulled together a chart So here's the original chart showing the O1 and O3 series of models and how O1 has managed to significantly improve, and then O3 has really improved on this benchmark, coming up to a score of above 75%, albeit at a high cost per task in terms of compute. Now, previously I spoke about DeepSeek v3. This is where DeepSeek v3 is performing, so just down around O1 mini. And the O1 model that has just been released is performing roughly on par with the O1 preview model and not quite as good as some of the stronger O1 models here. But quite notably, if you were to plot the cost per task of these two models, they would be so far off the chart that, they would be off the chart. The cost per task of the V3 model is less than a cent, and the cost of the DeepSeek R1 model is it's about 6 cents. So basically, DeepSeek are providing a similar level of reasoning as the O1 series of models, the lower end, the preview models, but doing so at a much reduced cost. Now, researchers have taken a lot of interest because the full paper has been released, and there have been some interesting realizations as to what approach is actually working for training these reasoning models. And the simple way for me to describe it is they are taking a base model that has been trained like a Llama model, or think of ChatGPT or GPT-4o, and they're then subjecting it to a process of recursive improvement. And during that recursive improvement, they will send in some, let's say, maths problems that have clear answers, yes or no, and they'll get the model to answer a maths problem, and they will score the answer as either being correct or not correct. And by feeding in this data to the model, at each step, they will try to update the model through optimization to shift it away from the bad answers and towards the good answers that were correct, that were numerically correct. And what they find is, as they iterate through these steps, they actually get responses that are longer and longer, and that begin to slowly reason and kind of step backwards if there's a mistake that's being made. And I'll just show you an example I showed last week, but there's this nice example here of calculating the 20th Fibonacci number. I'll start a new chat with deep think mode, and you'll see how the model will tend to be very verbose. So it's thinking maybe a bit like a human would. It's going through all these steps, backtracking, checking its assumptions. And so during the training, or during the reinforcement learning phase, this is the final phase of training, it was found that the models respond with longer and longer answers, and then they start to kind of think and backtrack, like saying, no, wait here. So this is somewhat of a breakthrough because it reveals that you can improve the reasoning just by kind of grading answers and having the model move more towards the correct answers than the wrong ones. That's as opposed to doing a non-iterative approach where you somehow would generate lots of reasoning data and just use that for fine-tuning. That would be a less iterative approach. And so potentially, if DeepSeek can scale the amount of compute, they would be able to scale this chart here and get up to the O3 levels of performance, although that's certainly not a guarantee. I think what's really missing in our understanding of how this process works is the data preparation. In order to even run this here, you need to have tons of maths problems, tons of reasoning problems, and it's not obvious how you generate those in an automated way. But tying back to the earlier portion of this video on the $500 billion spending, it certainly seems that OpenAI feels the way to go on getting better reasoning is to keep on scaling the data and to find programmatic ways to generate these reasoning questions so that those questions can then be used in order to iteratively improve the model. That's it for this week, folks. Cheers.